Welcome to your new game review and happy holidays. So in this one, you mentioned you never played a Slav, but you tried it out in an OTB game. But this I did not really understand as you're playing white here. So when you play d4 with white, you don't really have much of a choice in what the opponent can play, right? So is this your first Slav with white? Well, maybe. Okay, d4, d5, we have the London system. And c4, since the opponent is not playing c5, it makes sense for us to play c4. And here white has avoided all the gambit lines where black wins a pawn. Because now the pawn is on e3, this bishop is kind of decently placed. Okay, bishop f5 and queen b3. So this is the usual way to exploit the opponent's weak b7 pawn. And now queen b6, but this is known as a very good endgame usually for white, this endgame with a takes b3, because now white has this very simple positional plan. b4, b5, then he takes, the opponent takes with the pawn, and then b4, b5, again, with the second pawn. At the end of this, white will have a connected and protected passed pawn on c5, as well as a weak pawn on e7, which will be an easy target. But it seems white did not know this plan, as he never played b4, b5. Well, b4 was played, but not b5. And this should be played as quickly as possible. For example, here knight bd7, b4 is good. Knight h5. Already we could play b5. Well, maybe not here, but already this would kind of make sense. For example, knight f4 takes back. And after bishop e7, developing the bishop, we can already prepare the second b pawn. And our long-term plan is to take and play b5 again. Of course, we should develop pieces first. But okay, here bishop g5 was played, but this doesn't really save the bishop pair, so there wasn't really any point moving around like this, unless you're going to c7, as you mentioned, this line, rook c8, bishop e5. So this is not terribly obvious, but the point is, if black wants to take here, then now a7 is hanging, and after a6, this knight is actually trapped. After bishop e2, even if the knight is protected, g4 is played, and white will win a piece. So instead bishop g5, okay, still white is doing fine here, but it allows the opponent to develop the bishop swiftly, and black's only plan here is to play e5, which white understood. Here still we could play already b5, and ignore e5, because now we can just develop the knight. And next, we can try to take at some point and play b4, b5. Again, it's the same idea. We could develop the king as well. The king is quite well placed on d2. In some positions, we're threatening bishop d3. This isn't really a fork, because after this, the e-pawn would be pinned as well. So if we take away the bishop pair for black, we could also get rid of this advantage, which he has. And again, our plan, b4, b5, after taking on c6. And black cannot really do much about this. Okay, f4, this stops e5, and after g4, knight g2, e2. This is quite a weird way to develop. So of course we still have to finish our development. And this knight, of course, will have to go to e2 at some point, but why are we blocking off this bishop, right? The probably simplest way to develop would be king d2, bishop d3, and then knight g2, e2, as in the endgame. The king definitely should not castle, so there's no point. It can help here eventually to control some squares on the b file, or defend some weak pawn on e3, and as well to facilitate the exchange of the opponent's bishop pair, right? So there's no point in castling here. So knight g2, e2, and knight c1 was played. A bit strange, but okay. Now b6, and it makes sense for the opponent to try to make use of his advantage in development, as all of our pieces are in the first rank. But in the long term, this doesn't really make sense for black, as if he takes, we can take back, and it's the same as if white had played b5 and taken here, right? So black's idea is only the dynamic idea of playing a5, which we should have understood. And this can be very nicely prevented by a developing move, bishop a6, as you pointed out yourself. Now a5 is impossible. Also, there's a threat of going here. Next, we can just develop the king again, get the knight out of the first rank, and hopefully double on the a file and take the pawn on a7. Seems simple enough. And if here, then again, rook a2. This pawn is not really a weakness. We will eventually finish development. Again, king d2, knight d3, rook h to a1. Eventually, if we can play b4, b5. Again, creating the passed pawn on the f file, on the c file. Well, black can't really do anything in the way of counterplay. So bishop d3, but now takes and a5, and this is black's kind of only chance. As if it was white to move, then probably something like rook a6 would end the game more or less, as black would be out of counterplay with a weakness on the a file. So a5, and here castles, but this is a horrible move, and it really doesn't make sense. If your point is to develop the king, then we surely should go to d2, right? As in the endgame, the king should be an active piece, and we shouldn't voluntarily keep it right away from the game, right? So if king d2, now let's say he takes, we could take back and take the pawn on c6. And here we would get something similar to the game, but the king would be in a better position. For example, on c2, it could just defend the pawn on b2. Also, a variation that you showed, taking on a5. This is also quite logical, as if the opponent puts something on a square, why are we not checking whether or not we can take it? So now if the opponent is taking on a5, then this is of course horrible, because he has this very weak pawn on the a file. And after king d2, king c2, we're simply going to take it. If he defends on a8, it will be a pin. So black cannot take back here, so he has to take here. But after taking back, we are simply a pawn ahead, which again it's quite obvious, right? But you mentioned this, and sure, our structure is kind of somewhat ruined, but what exactly is black going to do here? We are a pawn ahead at the moment. Even this pawn is hanging, so notice we don't have to castle because the rook is already sometimes well placed on the h file. Of course, we probably shouldn't take this pawn, as everything is happening on the queen side. But what is the problem here? As we are a pawn ahead, in the worst case, we are going to lose a pawn, right? And at the end of it, black still has a lot of weaknesses. But after castling, this just allows black to ruin all of our structure, taking here at the base of the pawn chain, through which he's taking here, and everything collapses. So at the end of this, we get this position, rook b8, and now you add a choice between rook b1 and rook a2. And as you mentioned, rook b1 is way too passive. We cannot allow our rooks to be so horribly placed. In the endgame, the first rule is to play as actively as possible. So here, for example, if we feel that we must defend this pawn, we must defend it in the most active way, to at least allow the rook to, at some point, go forward. Of course, moves like rook a7 come to mind, but maybe at this point, the knight will just get improved. After rook b1, had black taken here, then we're just losing a very important pawn here. And if you calculated this far, it seems it's quite hard to defend. Now we must go here. And the opponent can just improve the knight as well, as you mentioned here as well. And the rook on b1 is terribly placed. If it was on a2, then at least at some point we would expect to get some kind of counterplay. But now there is no such counterplay. So rook b4. And now white really just has to sit down and defend this bad endgame, because he has a weakness here. Black has one pawn chain, and he doesn't really have any weaknesses. So knight c to a2, knight b6, b3. This doesn't really stop knight c4, but okay, the pawn is at least better placed. King f2, knight d2. So as we can see, white has way too many weaknesses. Rook a1, finally activating the rook. And now rook a4. This gives up the pawn on b3, but it turns out black shouldn't really take it, as the pawn is not really going anywhere anyway. And after this, now white is given the chance for some kind of counterplay with the move f5. The move f5 would ruin black's structure. Also, it would expose the pawn on g4. And generally, the defending side should aim for pawn exchanges, because the more pawns are exchanged, the closer we get to some kind of endgame like a rook and bishop against king, which would be a theoretical draw. So here, already f5 was quite interesting. The point being that if black takes, Now these pawns are very weak, and white can make use of it, for example, like this. If the rook goes to d3, then the knight can go to f4 as well. We are getting the pawn back on d5, and looking at the structure, it seems black will not really be able to create a passed pawn. So this is kind of some kind of a fortress type of draw. g2 is also well protected. But rook a8, king e7. Here white again had to play f5. Similar ideas. After rook e7, the king comes out, and these moves simply improved the opponent's king. Now f5 is played, but the king can take. After this, black keeps his idea of creating a passed pawn on the d file, which keeps the position winning for black. So this was not a very good pawn exchange. In the f5 sacrifices before, at least the pawns are doubled, so the opponent could not create a passed pawn. So now rook e7, the opponent kind of pushes his pawn, improves his pieces. So yes, of course, quite lost, but at some point we started to get chances again. Takes, and here, a few moves later, the opponent gave us a chance. Rook takes g2. Now you found rook e6 check. Point being that now the bishop is actually hanging because of, knight takes d3. But before it, I guess if here, then d2 simply. But after rook e6, this is not possible. And after king d4, you defended kind of well up until this point, but this was, of course, the chance. And as you asked yourself, can I capture anything? This is something we can always ask ourselves during the game. And here, of course, you cannot take the bishop because of d2, but after this, there is no more d2, right? And of course, still we should stay and defend here, and the defense is not terribly easy. But if we go to the side and start checking from the side, it turns out this king does not have a place to hide. So this would be objectively a draw. This is not terribly easy, but of course we should look to eliminate the opponent's most dangerous pawn. After this check though, after king c5, this pawn is going, unfortunately, and after this, the opponent has the more active king. Our king is cut off on the first rank, and unfortunately we can't really do anything about the passed pawn. So quite an unfortunate end game, since you were almost defending. Maybe you were down in spirits at this point, as the position does look rather hopeless. But as so happens in chess, we will always get some kind of chances, so we should always stay alert and keep our heads high. But overall, this was quite an interesting game strategically, up until this point, more or less, where white was kind of finishing development, but then castling, which was a huge mistake, and generally in these positions, we should not castle the king, as the king should be an active participant, and on d2 and on c2, it will be quite useful in defending some squares. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.